Chesapeake Bay. In 1608, Captain John Smith wrote, "Heaven and earth never agreed better to frame a place for man's habitation." The bay is the natural refuge for a variety of species. It's a world-renowned source of shellfish, Atlantic blue crab, Chesapeake oysters, and soft-shell clams. And it's a diverse setting for people to live. But over the years, people have carelessly abused the bay, and the natural resource has been severely depleted. This steel mill is the single largest polluter of Baltimore Harbor. And this paint factory dumped toxic materials into the water for years. So the question to answer about pollution in the bay is not whether damage has been done, but how much. The sheer scale of the bay makes this a question of great magnitude. The largest estuary in the United States, the bay is a giant tongue of water, bordered by 64,000 square miles of land. It reaches from the Atlantic Ocean inland, through Virginia, past Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and up to the Pennsylvania border. To the extent that the bay is affected by pollution, many people over a great expanse are affected too. The damage in the bay cannot be assessed without data that have been collected in a systematic fashion. This is the purpose of a long-term research project conducted by a multidisciplinary team of scientists. This team from Versar Incorporated, an environmental laboratory, is taking the bay's pulse by studying the bay's mud. 5 days a month, 10 months a year, the team collects mud specimens at more than 70 locations. The life in the mud, clams, worms, and other organisms, is the food that crabs and fish feed upon. The mounting toll of pollution can be measured by carefully studying changes in the type, abundance, and distribution of these creatures.
From a monitoring tool point of view, they have characteristics like they're not mobile, they sit still, they're easy to sample. We know how the environment affects their distributional patterns.
The difficult work of monitoring begins before sunrise. It's a team effort, a continuous process of gathering, sifting, bottling, and cataloging. Collecting sound data requires a planned sampling technique. At Station 5, Jack Gurley and Lisa Scott use a post-hole digger to grab samples of the shallow mud. In deeper water, a winch raises metal jaws that have taken a measured bite out of the bottom. The jaws are thoroughly rinsed between locations so that creatures from one sample aren't inadvertently mixed with another. 5 samples are taken at each site and carefully handled to preserve every creature that may be living in the mud.
The sieve has a specified mesh size opening so that we retain all the organisms we're interested in looking at. We sieve the sample in a cushion of water so that we don't damage them. And when I'm finished, I pass it over to Lisa, who bottles the sample and preserves it.
To understand the effect of factories, the team collects samples from 2 stations, one near and one further away from the shore. Even while they're collecting data, the difference between the stations is evident to the scientists.
There's an odor, a petroleum odor associated with the sediments. We don't find nearly as many organisms at this inner harbor station as we do in the outer harbor.
Biologists turn the collected samples over to lab technicians who measure and count them. Analyzing the data from so large a study requires the expertise of a number of disciplines. biology, ecology, and statistics. Hal Wilson is the head statistician on the project. Hal takes the sample data and, with the help of specialized computer software, begins the work of analyzing them. Here, the relationship between the width of a clam and the weight of a clam is linear. Using the regression line, we can measure clam width and predict its weight. Because weight can be predicted so well by the regression line, it doesn't have to be measured. This means that just one set of measurements can do the work of two in assessing the health of the creatures in the bay. With preliminary analysis like this in hand, researchers set about the more difficult task of understanding the effect of the seasons on the organisms that live in the bay's mud. Seasonal change is one facet of a larger problem that statisticians grapple with all the time: variation. The process of collecting and analyzing data is always complicated by the fact that most things vary over time. And we can't understand the varying effects of what people do without first understanding variation in nature. For instance, the deep salty bay is different from the freshwater estuaries that feed it. Temperature and flow varies from season to season, and a wet year is markedly different from a dry year. An analysis of a changing system must take account of these differences. Spotting the systematic patterns behind this variation is one of the main reasons data are collected.
Studies have the problem of trying to separate natural variation from man-induced variation, and seasonal variation is one very large component of it that you can't really separate out unless you have many years' worth of data.
One of nature's seasonal variations is salt content. That's because the Chesapeake is fed by a number of freshwater tributaries. The biggest of these is the Susquehanna River. There are other major rivers: the Patuxent, the Potomac, the Choptank, the Rappahannock, the York, and the James. With all of this fresh water flowing into the bay, the salt content of the water can vary dramatically, and this is important because the amount of salt in the water affects whether or not the organisms in the mud can breathe. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, so it sits on the top, trapping salt water underneath. This prevents surface oxygen from replenishing the salt water. So high river flow can cause oxygen levels to drop, and the creatures in the mud can suffocate. In addition to collecting mud at each station, researchers need to assess water conditions. Here, Lisa drops an electronic probe, which is designed to register both salt content and the dissolved oxygen in the water at the bottom of the bay. She then relays these measurements inside to Anna, where they're tabulated, so they can be compared to readings obtained at other stations.
It's possible in some deep areas of the bay during the summer to have oxygen drop below critical limits and to sometimes go to zero. And that condition poses an incredible stress to aquatic organisms.
People also contribute to changes in dissolved oxygen. Runoff from the 12 million acres of cropland and pastures that border the bay can choke off its oxygen supply. And the outflow from nearly 600 sewage treatment plants adds to the problem as well. Oxygen levels in the bay vary a great deal from season to season. The problem is that the natural variation is so large that it conceals the longer-term effects of increased pollution. So the statistician first has to remove seasonal variation before the team can interpret what the data really say about long-term trends. This is the concentration of dissolved oxygen over time that has been adjusted to remove the regular seasonal variation. It shows a downward trend, but not a significant one. But if we narrow our focus to only summertime dissolved oxygen, we can see the trend more clearly. The line does seem to be going down significantly, a strong indication that the health of the bay is imperiled.
In any estuary, the whole thing is not sick or the whole thing is not well. Different places have different kinds of problems. And in the deep central region of the bay, like what you see out behind me here, the anoxia, or the low dissolved oxygen, appears to be getting worse over time.
Using statistics as evidence, policymakers in states bordering the bay committed themselves to a 40% reduction in pollution from farm runoff and sewage treatment plants by the year 2000. Because of this and other actions, clams and worms are starting to come back in the bay. So even though some areas of the bay are ailing, researchers are starting to see signs of improvement.
The animals that are beginning to repopulate Baltimore Harbor are those animals that tend to be sensitive to pollutants. The water quality of the harbor, however, is far from pristine or clean. It's just better than it was, and it sort of goes to point out that you can use monitoring data and trend lines, or just regression lines, to assess whether things are getting better or worse.
Understanding a complex system requires that many disciplines work together, and statistics is central to the process. In the real world, where trends can be hard to pinpoint and even harder to interpret, conclusions drawn from sound statistical analysis are the key to taking decisive action. And without action, we run the risk of spoiling the bay, so that it will no longer be a fit place for either people or any other creatures to live.
Yeah, you're trying to understand what's happening over the long term, and you're trying to understand it for a purpose, and that purpose is, one, to provide a perspective for what you see in the short term, and two, to help you manage the resource better or more wisely.
Many things are being done here that haven't been done elsewhere, and so I feel there's some real importance to the work that's being done on Chesapeake Bay. That offers a lot of motivation to keep going and to look at the data, to do the analyses and really think about what we're getting.
This material has been excerpted from the college television course Against All Odds, Inside Statistics, and re-edited for use in high school curricula. Against All Odds is funded by the Annenberg CPB project. Additional funding provided by these companies and foundations. This adaptation is supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation.